To Sarah Vance's hands moved with precision, the needle pulling through the skin in small, deliberate motions. In the trauma bay of the bustling emergency department, she worked with steady, practiced efficiency, suturing a young man's arm from a simple fence injury. The patient barely flinched, scrolling through his phone with one hand, oblivious to the sharp sting of the stitch. It was just another night. Another injury, another case, but Sarah was different. Her movements were sharper, quicker, more confident than most. Nurse Liu Chen watched from the edge of the curtain, her gaze sharp, calculating, sensing something about Sarah that didn't quite fit the typical mold of a first-year attending. "It works," Sarah said, not even glancing up, her voice steady and unflinching. "Military, among other places." Liu didn't push, not yet. The case was simple enough, but there was more to Sarah Vance than just her ability to stitch. Behind her calm exterior, there were years of experiences buried deep within her, moments that others would never understand. As Sarah finished her work, the intercom crackled overhead, pulling her back to the present. "Dr. Vance, you're up for the next incoming, ETA 3 minutes." She stripped off her gloves, her face unreadable, and moved to the board, reading the details of the new trauma case. The department was a flurry of activity, staff rushing, patients coming and going. In the midst of it all, Sarah remained a silent observer, her presence commanding without a word. She knew what to do, where to go, how to act, reflexes sharpened by years in the field. As the doors burst open and paramedics wheeled in the next patient, a man with a gunshot wound to the thigh, Sarah's mind flicked through the necessary steps. The pressure dressing was holding, but the man was still in critical condition. She was ready. It was the kind of night where everything seemed to come together and fall apart at once. A night that would test more than just her medical skill. It would test who she really was, beneath the surface. But for now she focused on the patient in front of her, her hands working, her mind clear. She was in charge here, and she would do whatever it took to save him. The gurney rattled into trauma 2, and Sarah moved like she had done 1,000 times before. Hands already reaching for the supplies, her mind calculating the next steps. The paramedics delivered their report, their voices steady, but Sarah barely registered the details. She had already assessed the man in front of her, a 30-something-year-old, conscious but fading, blood soaking through the pressure, dressing on his left thigh. The vitals on the monitor were unsettling. His blood pressure was low, his heart rate elevated. He was circling the drain. GSW to the thigh, no exit wound, blood loss controlled in the field, morphine given, the paramedic said, his voice even, professional. Sarah nodded, stepping into the role she had been trained for. No questions, no hesitation. She was surgical, moving with the kind of precision that came from years of experience in both the field and the trauma bay. She cut away the dressing, blood welling up, dark and sticky. "How long until we get him to surgery?" she asked Lou, her voice calm but sharp, cutting through the chaos. Lou, who had been working alongside her for months, didn't need to ask for clarification. She knew what Sarah meant. The patient needed stabilization, and that was her job now. As Sarah worked, her mind flicked to the subtle flash of recognition from one of the paramedics earlier. She hadn't missed it. The tattoo on the back of her neck, just visible enough to catch the eye of someone who had seen it before. The anchor with the caduceus, the emblem of a Navy medic. It was the kind of ink that got attention in a hospital, but she wasn't here to explain herself. Not to him, not to anyone. It didn't matter. What mattered was saving lives. The pressure in the room intensified as Sarah worked, each second counting, each movement calculated. She looked at the man again, his eyes fluttering, his body fighting against the inevitable. She was moving faster now, pushing herself, but her calm never broke. The bullet had missed the artery, but the damage was still severe. Sarah's hands moved in practiced rhythm, applying pressure to stop the bleeding, preparing to extract the bullet. The paramedic, the younger one with the tattoos, still lingered in the doorway. His eyes never left her, and she could feel the question forming in his mind. But Sarah didn't answer it. She didn't need to. She didn't have to tell him anything. Her hands, her skill, spoke louder than words. She finished her work, stabilized the patient, and turned to Lou. "Get him ready for surgery. He'll need antibiotics and a follow-up in 5 days." Sarah stripped off her gloves, the familiar weight of the responsibility settling over her like a mantle. Another patient saved, another life in her hands. But in the back of her mind, the same question lingered. How long would she keep running from her past? The thought faded as she turned toward the next trauma, her mind already shifting gears, her body moving without thinking. There was always more work to do. The shift wore on, each case blending into the next, the constant rhythm of the emergency department a backdrop to Sarah's focus. Trauma after trauma, each one a puzzle to be solved, a challenge to be met with calm efficiency. But beneath the surface, there was a tension that Sarah couldn't shake, a sense that she was constantly being watched, evaluated. She could feel it in the eyes of the staff, the residents, even the paramedics who came through the doors. The older ones, like Dr. Marcus Hyland, observed with professional detachment. But there was something in his gaze that lingered. Sarah noticed it now, the way he would study her after each case, the flicker of something more than just professional curiosity. It was as if he was trying to figure her out, trying to understand what made her tick. And for the first time in a long time, Sarah found herself wondering if he was right to question her. The night continued, but Sarah's mind kept drifting back to that moment with the young paramedic, the one who had recognized her tattoo. His hesitation, the flicker of recognition in his eyes, made her wonder how long she could keep her past buried. She had left that life behind, or so she had thought. But it seemed like it was always there, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to resurface. Sarah shook the thought away as she moved toward the next case. A 54-year-old male presenting with upper quadrant pain, nausea and fever. The diagnosis was a textbook case of cholecystitis. But something in Sarah's gut told her there was more to it than that. She ran through the physical exam quickly, the usual questions, the usual checks. But as the ultrasound tech set up the imaging, Sarah's mind began to race. The gallbladder was thickened, but it wasn't the gallbladder that caught her attention. It was the shadow on the screen, just above it, a small, subtle anomaly that no one else would have caught. Sarah leaned in closer. "Go back to the previous view," she said, her voice steady but insistent. The tech adjusted the probe, and Sarah's suspicion was confirmed. There, just to the left of the gallbladder, was free fluid pooling in the perirenal space. Sarah's heart rate didn't spike, her hands didn't shake, but her mind was already calculating the next steps. This wasn't a simple gallbladder issue. This was a splenic artery aneurysm that had ruptured, and the patient was bleeding internally. Sarah moved quickly, calling for a surgical team and a transfusion, ordering the necessary tests and preparations. The team followed her lead without hesitation, a well-oiled machine in motion. As the patient was prepped for surgery, Sarah remained by his side, her focus unwavering. She was in control, she always was. But as the patient was wheeled out, Sarah's mind drifted back to the young paramedic once again, the one who had recognized her ink, the one who knew, without a doubt, that she had been there before. The question lingered, but it wasn't one Sarah was ready to answer. Not yet. Not to him, and not to anyone else. She wasn't ready to face what that recognition meant. Not when she still had so much left to prove. Not when she was still fighting to outrun the ghosts of her past. The hours blurred together, each case pulling Sarah deeper into the rhythm of the trauma center. The work was relentless, the pressure unyielding. But it was the kind of work Sarah had trained for. Every stitch, every incision, every decision, her hands moved with precision, her mind sharp. There was little time for anything else, no time for distractions, no room for doubts. But as the night wore on, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Dr. Marcus Hyland, who had been distant at best since she arrived, had begun to show more interest in her methods. His comments, though subtle, hinted at something more, an evaluation of her skills, her judgment, and perhaps her past. Sarah had seen the way he looked at her after each case, the quiet calculation in his gaze. It was as though he was trying to piece together who she was, trying to understand the woman who moved with the calm of someone who had seen too much. Sarah didn't like it. She wasn't here to answer questions, especially not from someone who had no idea what she had been through. The tension simmered beneath the surface, but she didn't let it show. She couldn't. She had a job to do, and that was all that mattered. The next case came in, a 26-year-old male with a gunshot wound to the abdomen. His blood pressure was low, his heart rate high, and his breathing was becoming increasingly labored. Sarah was quick to assess the situation, her hands moving without hesitation as she placed the patient on the table and began working. There was no time to waste. Lou, who had been by her side for months now, handed her the necessary tools without needing to ask. Sarah could feel the familiar weight of the trauma bay settling over her shoulders. It was a weight she carried with ease, but there was a quiet, unspoken pressure behind it. The room was chaotic as everyone worked in sync. But Sarah was the center of it all, her movements calm and controlled. She felt the pressure in the patient's abdomen, felt the way the blood pooled beneath her fingers. This wasn't just another gunshot wound. This was something more. She pressed harder, her fingers digging into the tissue as she felt for the source of the bleeding. It was deep, but not as deep as it could have been. The injury was serious, but Sarah was confident she could control it. Her hands moved quickly, efficiently, her mind calculating every step. There was a moment, a split second, where everything slowed down. Sarah's fingers found the source of the bleeding, a ruptured vessel in the abdomen. She applied pressure, but the blood wouldn't stop. The room around her was filled with the sound of frantic orders, the beep of monitors, the movement of people rushing to assist. But it was Sarah alone in the moment who would decide whether this patient lived or died. Her eyes locked on the wound, her hands steady despite the rising tension. She could feel the weight of the decision pressing on her chest, but she didn't hesitate. Not this time, not ever. Lou, get me a trauma kit and a central line. We're going to stabilize him first. Her voice was calm, but there was a sharpness to it. A quiet authority that had been earned, not given. Lou moved without question, setting up the necessary supplies. Sarah remained focused on the patient, working quickly to control the bleeding. Her hands moved with purpose, each decision made with a clarity that could only come from experience. The patient's vitals were dropping, but Sarah didn't let it rattle her. She had seen worse, been through worse. This was just another moment to get through, another life to save. As the patient was transferred to the operating room, Sarah stepped back, wiping her hands on a towel. The weight of the moment lifted slightly, but it was never truly gone. She glanced over at Lou, who was cleaning up the tools. Lou didn't speak, but Sarah knew what she was thinking. She had seen the way Lou watched her, the way her eyes lingered just a little longer than necessary. There was something unspoken between them now, something that Sarah couldn't quite place, but she didn't have time to dwell on it. Not when there was more work to do, not when there were still lives to be saved. As Sarah moved to the next case, her thoughts drifted briefly to the paramedic who had recognized her tattoo, the one who had known, without question, that she wasn't just a doctor, she was something else. Someone else. Sarah shook the thought away. She couldn't afford to let her past interfere with the present. Not now. Not when the work was all that mattered. The hours stretched on, and the work never slowed. Sarah's body was tired, but her mind remained sharp. She had seen every kind of trauma imaginable in her years as a military medic, and now as an attending physician in the civilian world. The cases felt like a continuation of the same rhythm, the same urgency. The names, the faces, the circumstances, they changed, but the work didn't. The patients were different, their stories unique. But Sarah's hands knew what to do, her instincts guided her every move. But the pressure, that feeling of being constantly evaluated, never left. It weighed on her, gnawing at her with every passing moment. Dr. Hyland's presence loomed over her like a shadow, his eyes always observing, calculating. She could feel his gaze following her as she worked, the subtle disapproval he had shown in the beginning turning into something else, something more like respect, but still laced with uncertainty. It wasn't enough for him, and it wasn't enough for her either. Sarah could see the way the staff whispered when she passed, the way the paramedics eyed her with curiosity. She wasn't just a doctor to them. She was something different. The paramedic who had recognized her tattoo, the one who had seen the Navy insignia behind her ear, had made that clear. He hadn't said anything outright, but Sarah could see it in his eyes. He knew she wasn't just another physician. She had been somewhere, done something, and that something was etched into the ink on her skin. The thought lingered as Sarah prepped for the next case. It was a 32-year-old man with a severe head injury, a result of a motor vehicle accident. His vitals were unstable, and his Glasgow coma scale was low. The brain injury was obvious, But Sarah wasn't just looking at the obvious. She knew how to assess the hidden risks, the internal damage that could turn fatal if left undetected. She moved quickly, her hands steady as she ordered a CT scan and prepared the patient for surgery. The team fell into line without hesitation, following her lead. As the imaging came back, Sarah's suspicion was confirmed. The patient had a brain hemorrhage that required immediate intervention. But the more pressing concern was his vital signs. His blood pressure was dropping, his heart rate rising. The trauma bay became a blur of activity as Sarah worked with her team, stabilizing the patient as best as they could. She called for a neurosurgeon and prepared for surgery, but there was a part of her that knew it might be too late. Still she worked, her hands moving in a practiced rhythm. The pressure of the department, the weight of responsibility, it never went away. It was always there, but she had learned to carry it. She had learned to use it. The man was transferred to surgery, and Sarah was left standing in the trauma bay, her hands still covered in blood, her mind already moving on to the next case. But this time, there was a shift in the air. She could feel it. Hyland had been watching her again, but now his expression was different. There was no judgment in his eyes. Instead, there was a hint of something like admiration, even if he wouldn't admit it. Sarah didn't need his approval. She never had. She had done her job, saved lives, and that was enough for her. The rest, the whispers, the curiosity, the questions about her past could wait. But as she turned to leave the trauma bay, the door swung open and the paramedic from earlier, the one who had recognized her tattoo, stood in the doorway. His eyes met hers, and for a moment the unspoken understanding between them was palpable. He didn't ask, he didn't need to. Sarah just nodded, and without a word, she moved past him, back into the flow of the department. There was no time for anything else. Not today, not ever, not when there was still more work to be done. By the time the night began to wind down, Sarah felt the exhaustion settle into her bones, but it wasn't the physical fatigue that gnawed at her. It was the weight of the hours, the constant motion, the feeling of always being on the edge, always performing, always answering questions without ever asking any. She had done everything she could for the patients in her care, but still, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more she was being asked to prove. It wasn't just her medical skills that were under scrutiny. It was everything about her, from her past to her present. She could feel it in the air, in the way the staff looked at her, in the way Hyland's eyes followed her every move. The subtle tension, the constant sense of evaluation, the feeling that she was always being tested. It was something she couldn't escape. Even now, as she scrubbed her hands and prepared for the next case, she could feel his gaze on her, as if he were trying to decipher a code she wasn't willing to share. She had left that world behind. The military, the field, the combat, it was all supposed to be in the past, but somehow it always followed her. As if it was stitched into her very being, like the ink on her skin that the paramedic had noticed earlier. It was a reminder of everything she had done, everything she had seen, everything she had lost. She had buried it, pushed it down deep, but the ghosts were still there, waiting to resurface at the most inconvenient of times. The next case was a 27-year-old woman who had been in a motorcycle accident. She was conscious, but her vital signs were unstable, and there was visible trauma to her chest and abdomen. Sarah moved quickly, assessing the situation with the practiced efficiency that had become second nature to her. The team moved around her, but it was Sarah who was the center of it all, her calm under pressure, guiding the others as they worked to stabilize the patient. The woman had a collapsed lung and internal bleeding, and her condition was deteriorating rapidly. Sarah didn't hesitate. She called for a chest tube and ordered a trauma panel, her voice steady and commanding as she took control of the situation. The pressure in the room intensified, but Sarah never faltered. She was the rock, the one everyone turned to when things got chaotic. As the chest tube was inserted and the patient's breathing stabilized, Sarah stepped back for a moment, her eyes scanning the room. She could feel the weight of the decision still hanging in the air, the unspoken questions from her colleagues, the doubts that lingered. But she didn't let it affect her, not anymore. She had learned to carry the weight of others' expectations without letting it crush her. It wasn't about them, it was about the patients, about doing her job. And in that moment, with the patient's vitals stabilizing and the chaos of the trauma bay finally receding, Sarah allowed herself a small breath of relief. For just a moment, she allowed herself to be human again. The moment passed quickly, though. The doors opened, and another case was brought in, another life to be saved. She moved without a thought, without hesitation, back into the flow of the department. But even as she worked, even as she focused on the next patient, a part of her mind remained fixed on the man who had been watching her all night. Dr. Marcus Hyland. His gaze had shifted, she could feel it, the subtle change in the way he looked at her, the shift from skepticism to something else. Was it respect? Or was it just another test, another challenge to be met? Sarah didn't know, but she wasn't about to ask. Not yet, she had a job to do, and that was all that mattered. Sarah's focus never wavered as the shift continued, her hands moving with practiced precision from one patient to the next, each case a new challenge, each decision a critical one. But somewhere beneath the surface, the tension remained, that ever-present awareness that she was being observed, not just for her medical skills, but for something more. She could feel Hyland's eyes on her, scrutinizing her every move. And even though she had become accustomed to this feeling in the military, it was different here. There she had been just another medic among soldiers, but here in the sterile corridors of the trauma bay, she was something more. She had seen it in the eyes of the paramedics, the nurses, the residents. The unspoken recognition that she was different, but it wasn't the kind of difference that earned her respect. It was the kind that made people wonder just how far she was willing to go to save a life. The night was wearing on, and the cases continued to roll in. Sarah worked without pause, her mind a whirlwind of calculations, her body moving without thought. But the moment she stepped into the break room for a brief reprieve, she found herself caught off guard. The young paramedic, the one who had recognized her tattoo earlier, was sitting at the table, waiting for her. It was sitting at house. His eyes met hers the moment she walked in, and for a second Sarah felt a flicker of hesitation. He knew, she realized. He knew what she was hiding, and that awareness was like a weight pressing down on her chest. She had never intended for anyone to find out about her past. It wasn't something she talked about, not to her colleagues, not to the people who depended on her for care. It was a chapter of her life she had closed, buried deep within her. But now, with him sitting there, his eyes full of unasked questions, she couldn't escape the truth. She couldn't outrun it any longer. The paramedic stood as Sarah approached, his posture tense, as if he were unsure of how to address her. Dr. Vance, I just wanted to say, I know who you are, what you did, where you've been. He faltered, his voice breaking slightly. Sarah's expression remained unreadable as she met his gaze, but inside she felt a rush of conflicting emotions. This was exactly what she had feared. The recognition, the questions, the judgment. She had spent so many years trying to outrun her past, trying to be someone new, but it seemed that no matter where she went, it always followed her. You don't have to say anything, Sarah replied, her voice calm, almost too calm. I'm just here to do my job, and that's all you need to know. The paramedic hesitated, but something in Sarah's voice must have told him to back off, because he nodded, his eyes flicking away. I get it, he said quietly, before turning and walking out of the room. Sarah stood there for a moment, her body stiff with the weight of the conversation, but she didn't allow herself to react. Not here, not now. She had work to do, and she wasn't about to let her past derail her. But as she stepped back into the trauma bay, her mind was already racing, replaying the exchange over and over again. She couldn't escape who she had been, and for the first time in years, she wondered if she even wanted to. As the doors opened, bringing in the next patient, Sarah steeled herself once more. This wasn't about her. This was about the people who needed her. It always had been, and as long as there were lives to save, she would keep moving forward, one patient at a time. The shift dragged on, the hours blurring into one long, continuous stretch of tension and responsibility. Every case Sarah handled felt heavier than the last, not because of the medical challenges, but because of the constant weight of the questions that hovered over her. The paramedic from earlier, his recognition lingering in the back of her mind, was just the beginning. There were whispers, subtle but persistent, from the staff, from the residents, from anyone who had noticed the way Sarah moved, the way she worked with such precision and confidence. They couldn't understand it. They couldn't see the experience that lay beneath the surface of her calm demeanor. They didn't know what she had been through, what she had seen, and what it had done to her. They just saw a doctor who seemed too composed, too efficient, too different. It didn't matter how many lives she saved or how many hours she worked. As long as they didn't understand her past, as long as they didn't know what made her who she was, they would keep watching her like she was a puzzle to be solved. But tonight, Sarah had no time to dwell on that. The trauma bay was full, and each new patient brought a new set of challenges. A woman in her late 20s, crushed under a car, multiple fractures and internal bleeding. A man with severe burns from a kitchen fire. A teenager with a gunshot wound to the chest. Each case demanded her attention, her expertise, and her focus. She moved through them all, her hands steady, her mind sharp, her actions precise. There was no room for hesitation, no room for anything other than the work in front of her. But even as Sarah operated in this familiar zone, her thoughts kept circling back to the paramedic. She had recognized the look in his eyes, the same one that had haunted her for years. The recognition of someone who had been there, who had seen things they shouldn't have had to see, and who had carried those things with them ever since. He had known who she was, not just by the tattoo, but by the way she moved, by the way she carried herself. It was the same way the military medics had recognized her in the field, the way they had known she wasn't just another nurse or doctor, but someone who had been through the fire and come out the other side. Sarah had never been good at hiding her past, not really. She had tried, but it was always there, just beneath the surface, waiting to surface when she least expected it. The truth was, she had been running from it for so long that she had forgotten what it felt like to just be herself. She wasn't sure if that was a good thing or a bad thing. The night went on, the cases steady, the work constant. Sarah kept her focus on the patients, on the task at hand, but every time she turned a corner or walked past a nurse's station, the feeling that she was being watched intensified. And then, at 4:30 a.m., just as the department was starting to slow down, Sarah's pager went off. Incoming trauma. Severe head injury. 45-year-old male. ETA 4 minutes. Sarah didn't hesitate. She moved quickly, grabbing her gown and gloves, already assessing the situation in her mind. But as she stepped into the trauma bay, the familiar feeling of dread settled over her. She wasn't just being watched now, she was being tested. By who, she wasn't sure. But it didn't matter. The work was still there, the responsibility still hers, and she would rise to meet it as she always had. She stepped forward, pushing the thoughts of the paramedic and the whispers from the staff to the back of her mind. There was a patient in front of her, and that was all that mattered. The trauma bay was a blur of motion as Sarah and her team moved swiftly to stabilize the incoming patient, a 45-year-old man with a severe head injury. His vitals were deteriorating, his blood pressure plummeting, and his pupils were unresponsive. The CT scan confirmed what Sarah had suspected, a massive subdural hematoma. Time was ticking, and every second mattered. She ordered immediate intubation and pushed for a neurosurgical consult. As she worked, her mind moved through the steps of the procedure almost automatically, her hands following the rhythm of the work. But there was something different about this case, something that Sarah couldn't quite put her finger on. It wasn't just the trauma, it wasn't just the urgency. It was the quiet pressure that had been building all night. The feeling that everything she did was being scrutinized, not just for its medical merit, but for something else. She could feel it in the way the staff moved around her, in the way de Hyland's eyes never left her. He was watching her again, evaluating her, but this time it wasn't just about her abilities as a doctor. She could feel the weight of his gaze as if he were searching for something more than just her competence. The pressure in the room intensified as Sarah continued to work, her hands steady as she applied pressure to stop the bleeding in the patient's head, her mind calculating the next steps. She knew what she was doing, she always did, but the doubt in Hyland's eyes lingered, and she couldn't shake it. It was a question she had been avoiding all night, a question that kept resurfacing in the quiet moments. What did he see when he looked at her? Was it just the work, or was there something more? Sarah didn't have time to dwell on it. The man's condition continued to worsen. His blood pressure dropped to dangerously low levels, and his heart rate began to slow. Sarah's mind raced. If they didn't act quickly, he was going to code. She called for a surgical team to prep for a craniotomy. her voice cutting through the chaos with the precision of a commander giving orders on the battlefield. But even as she spoke, she could feel the weight of her own uncertainty creeping in. The doubts, the questions, the feeling that somehow, in some way, she was being pushed to prove herself. Again. She couldn't shake the feeling that tonight wasn't just about saving lives. It was about something else, something deeper. The man was rushed into surgery, and Sara stood in the empty trauma bay, her hands still gloved, her mind racing. The silence in the room felt suffocating, and the questions lingered in the air. What was Hyland really thinking? What did he see when he looked at her? She had never been good at hiding her past. But maybe, just maybe, that was what made her different. That was what gave her an edge. But even as she tried to push the thoughts out of her mind, she knew they would always be there. They were part of who she was, whether she liked it or not. As the hours ticked by, Sara worked through the remaining cases with mechanical precision, but the weight of her own thoughts never fully lifted. The trauma bay was quieter now, the rush of the night slowing as dawn approached. But Sara couldn't shake the feeling that something was changing. Something was shifting in the way she was being perceived. It wasn't just about the medicine anymore. It was about who she was, what she had done, and whether or not the world was ready to accept her for it. The morning light began to filter through the windows of the trauma bay, casting long shadows across the sterile white floors. Sara stood at the central desk, reviewing the charts from the night shift, her mind still churning with the weight of everything that had transpired. The patient from the head injury had been taken to surgery and was now stable in the ICU. But Sara couldn't shake the feeling that the night had been about more than just medical procedures. It had been about proving herself, not just as a doctor, but as someone who had buried her past and tried to build something new. And yet, with every passing hour, it seemed like her past was finding its way back into the room, into her thoughts. The door to the trauma bay opened, and Lou stepped in, her eyes meeting Sara's. "Hyland's looking for you, wants to debrief the case from last night." Sara didn't reply immediately. Her thoughts were elsewhere. Her past had come crashing into the present, and now she had to face it. The questions that had been lingering in the air for so long. What did Hyland see in her? What was he expecting from her? What had he been trying to figure out all this time? She knew she wasn't the same person who had entered this hospital 6 months ago, but she wasn't sure if anyone else saw that. Maybe she was still too much of a mystery to them. Or maybe, like Hyland, they just couldn't reconcile the woman who stood before them with the woman they could only imagine. "Sara?" Lou's voice broke through her thoughts. Sara looked up, meeting Lou's gaze. "Yeah, I'll be right there." The weight of the moment pressed on her chest, but she squared her shoulders and walked toward Hyland's office. When she stepped into the room, the door clicking shut behind her, she found Hyland standing by the window, looking out over the city. There was a pause before he turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "Sit," he said, motioning to the chair across from him. Sara did as she was told, sitting down and crossing her arms over her chest. Hyland didn't speak immediately. Instead, he stood there for a long moment, his eyes studying her. Sara held his gaze, her mind racing. Finally, he spoke. "You're a hell of a doctor, Sara." The words weren't what she expected. They weren't filled with the suspicion or doubt she had been bracing for. They were respect, and something else, something closer to admiration. She didn't know how to respond. She had worked so hard to keep her past hidden, to keep her distance from the people here, but now it felt like the walls were closing in. "You've got something," he continued, his voice quieter now. "Something that goes beyond the books, beyond the protocols, something that most of us don't understand. But it works. It works when nothing else does." Sara's throat tightened, but she said nothing. She wasn't here to explain herself. "You're right," she said finally, her voice steady but low. "I don't fit in here, not entirely, but I'm doing my job, that's all that matters." Hyland nodded slowly. "Yeah, it is. But you can't keep pretending there's nothing else. You've got a skill, Sara, something that we can use. I've seen it, and I want you to teach it." Sara raised an eyebrow. "Teach?" "Teach," Hyland confirmed. "We've got a program here for trauma care, but it's missing something. It's missing the kind of experience you bring. The kind of experience that saves lives in ways that textbooks don't cover." Sara was silent for a moment, processing what he was saying. The idea of teaching, of stepping into that role, was something she had never considered. But the more she thought about it, the more it made sense. Maybe this was how she could bridge the gap between her past and her future. Maybe this was how she could make peace with the things she had done and the things she still had to do. She looked at Highland, her expression unreadable. "What makes you think I'm the right person for this?" she asked. "Because you've done it before, in the field, in places where the rules don't apply and every second counts. You know how to make decisions when there's no easy answer. That's what we need." Sarah thought for a moment, then nodded. "All right, I'll do it." Highland smiled, a rare expression for him. "Good. I think this place could use more people like you." Sarah stood, turning toward the door, but then paused. She had always worked alone, but maybe that was about to change. "Sarah," Highland said, his voice softer now, "I've been wrong about you. I've underestimated you." Sarah didn't look back as she walked out of the office. She didn't need to hear him say anything more. She already knew. The decision she had made wasn't just about her work, it was about what she had learned, what she had carried with her, and how she could finally use it to help others. When Sarah left the hospital that morning, the sun was rising, casting a golden light over the city. She felt the weight of the past lifting, bit by bit, and for the first time in a long while, she felt like maybe, just maybe, she was exactly where she needed to be. And when she looked down at the tattoo behind her ear, she didn't hide it. She didn't have to anymore. The past had shaped her, yes, but it didn't define her. Not anymore. As she walked into the new day, Sarah felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. She had made it through the storm. And now she was ready for whatever came next. Если эта история тронула вас эмоционально, подпишитесь на наш канал, напишите свое мнение в комментариях и поделитесь этим видео с другими.